continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Derek Morrison had built his life like a fortress, methodical, calculated, and seemingly impenetrable. At 38, he owned a successful construction company that specialized in luxury homes for Phoenix's elite. His calloused hands bore witness to years of labor before he'd transitioned to the business side, but those same hands could still frame a house or demolish one with equal precision. The Morrison household on Camelback Mountain was Derek's crown jewel, 6,000 square feet of glass and steel that he designed and built himself. Every beam, every fixture, every security camera had been personally selected. Crystal, his wife of 12 years, had initially been impressed by his attention to detail. Now she found it suffocating. Crystal Morrison had married Derek when she was 24 and he was 26, fresh out of college with dreams bigger than her trust fund could support. Derek's blue-collar determination had seemed romantic then, a rough-hewn prince who could build her castle. She'd been drawn to his quiet intensity, the way his gray eyes seemed to calculate everything twice before speaking. But 12 years of marriage had worn thin the novelty of Derek's methodical nature. Crystal craved spontaneity, excitement, the kind of thrill that her husband's predictable schedule couldn't provide. Her days were filled with yoga classes, lunch dates, and charity events, a life of comfortable emptiness that left her hungry for something more dangerous. That hunger had led her to Brett Hoffman 6 months ago. Brett was everything Derek wasn't. Impulsive, charming, reckless. A successful real estate agent who specialized in high-end properties, he moved through Phoenix's social circles with the kind of casual confidence that made women notice and men either envy or despise him. At 35, Brett had never been married, preferring to keep his options open and his commitments minimal. Their affair had begun at a charity auction where Brett was selling a penthouse and Crystal was bidding on art pieces for their home. He made a joke about her husband's absence, something about construction workers keeping regular hours, and she'd laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. "Your husband builds houses," Brett had said over champagne, "but does he build dreams?" It was a line he'd used before, but Crystal had been hungry enough to take the bait. Derek's best friend since high school, Miguel Santos, had noticed the changes first. Miguel owned a security consulting firm and had an eye for details that came from years of military service. He'd watched Crystal become more secretive with her phone, more critical of Derek's work schedule, more interested in appearing unavailable when Derek called during the day. "She's restless," Miguel had warned Derek over beers 3 months ago. Restless women do stupid things. Derek had dismissed the concern then. He trusted Crystal, trusted the life they'd built together. He provided for her, gave her freedom, respected her independence. What more could she want? But Miguel's words had planted a seed of awareness. Derek began noticing things. Crystal's new perfume, her sudden interest in fitness classes that ran late into the evening, the way she'd started calling him predictable with a tone that wasn't quite affectionate. Derek Morrison was many things, but naive wasn't one of them. When suspicion finally took root, he approached it the same way he approached everything else, with methodical precision. The investigation took 2 weeks. Derek installed tracking software on Crystal's phone during one of her yoga classes, positioned cameras in her car during a supposed girls' night out, and hired a private investigator to document what he already suspected. The evidence was comprehensive and devastating. Photos of Crystal and Brett at restaurants across the city, videos of them entering and leaving Brett's downtown condo, phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts. The private investigator, a retired police detective named Roy Vasquez, had even captured audio recordings of their conversations. "I feel like I'm finally alive again," Crystal's voice had said through Derek's speakers as he sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the evidence. "Derek's so routine. So predictable. He thinks providing for me is the same as loving me." Brett's response had been a laugh. Guys like him, they think marriage is a business contract. All transactions, no passion. You deserve better than a glorified contractor. Derek had played that recording 17 times, memorizing every inflection, every casual cruelty. By the time he'd finished, the man who'd built a business on creating dreams for other families had decided to become a nightmare for the two people who destroyed his own. The plan began forming immediately. Derek Morrison had always been a builder, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes you had to tear down before you could create something better. Christmas was 6 weeks away. Chapter 2: The Architect of Ruin. Derek's transformation began subtly. To the outside world, he remained the same reliable, hard-working husband. He kissed Crystal goodbye each morning, asked about her day each evening, and maintained a facade of marital contentment with the skill of a master craftsman. But beneath the surface, Derek Morrison was designing the most important project of his life: the complete and total destruction of Crystal and Brett's world. The first step required understanding his targets completely. Derek had always believed that knowledge was the foundation of any successful build, and revenge required the same meticulous planning as constructing a skyscraper. Crystal, he learned through 12 years of marriage, was driven by image and social status. She needed to be admired, envied, seen as successful and desirable. Her greatest fear was embarrassment, being exposed as anything less than perfect. She'd rather suffer in silence than admit failure publicly. Brett Hoffman was more complex. Through careful research and a few strategic conversations with mutual acquaintances, Derek discovered that Brett's charm masked a dangerous game of financial juggling. He lived beyond his means, maintained his lifestyle through carefully managed debt, and had built his reputation on commission from sales that required constant hustle to maintain. More importantly, Brett had a weakness for married women specifically. Derek found evidence of at least 3 previous affairs, all with wives of successful men, all ending when the women chose their security over their passion. Brett seemed to enjoy the challenge of seducing women who had something to lose. Derek's plan required allies, and he began cultivating them with the same patience he'd once used to build his business from nothing. The first was Lindsay Palmer, Crystal's best friend and unwitting accomplice to the affair. Lindsay was a divorce attorney who thrived on drama and gossip, the kind of woman who collected secrets like trophies. She'd been covering for Crystal's affair, providing alibis and encouraging the relationship with the enthusiasm of someone who lived vicariously through other scandals. Derek approached Lindsay's involvement carefully. During a dinner party at their home, he'd mentioned his concerns about Crystal's distance, his worry that she might be unhappy. Lindsay had been quick to reassure him, perhaps too quick, and Derek had filed away her defensive responses for future use. The second ally was unexpected: Brett's own business partner, Amanda Cross. Derek had met Amanda at a property development meeting where Brett was notably absent, supposedly closing a major deal. Amanda was sharp, ambitious, and clearly frustrated with Brett's unreliable behavior. Brett's talented. Amanda had confided over coffee, but he treats this business like a game. He thinks charm can replace commitment. Derek had listened, asked thoughtful questions, and learned that Brett's recent success was largely due to Amanda's behind-the-scenes work. She was the one who researched properties, managed client relationships, and ensured contracts were properly executed. Brett was the face, but Amanda was the foundation. By November, Derek had assembled a comprehensive understanding of his target's vulnerabilities. Crystal needed social approval and financial security. Brett needed constant validation and income flow. Lindsay needed drama, but feared professional consequences. Amanda needed stability and recognition. Derek began constructing his revenge with the precision of an architect drafting blueprints. The first move came through Amanda. Derek approached her with a business proposition. His construction company needed a reliable real estate partner for a new development project, a luxury housing community that would be his company's largest undertaking. The commission potential was enormous, enough to transform Amanda's career. "I prefer to work with you directly," Derek had told her over lunch. "Brett seems distracted lately. I need partners I can rely on." Amanda had been immediately interested. The project was real. Derek had been planning the development for years, but now it served a dual purpose. Amanda's excitement about the opportunity meant she began questioning Brett's commitment to their partnership, especially as Derek carefully documented Brett's increasing absences and unreliability. The second move targeted Crystal's social circle. Derek began hosting business dinners at their home, inviting Phoenix's social elite. He played the role of devoted husband perfectly, praising Crystal publicly while privately documenting her discomfort with the domestic facade. Derek's been so attentive lately. Crystal complained to Lindsay after one particularly successful dinner party. Derek's security cameras had captured the conversation. It's like he's trying to prove something. It's suffocating. Maybe he suspects something, Lindsay had suggested, and Derek had watched his wife's face change, fear flickering across her features before being replaced by defiance. Let him suspect, Crystal had said. I'm tired of living like a widow. Brett makes me feel alive. Derek had saved that recording in a special folder on his computer, labeled simply Evidence. By December, the foundation of Derek's plan was set. Amanda was ready to end her partnership with Brett, armed with documentation of his unreliability that Derek had helped her compile. Crystal's social circle was beginning to notice cracks in the Morrison marriage, though they attributed them to Derek's increased work demands rather than Crystal's infidelity. The final piece required the most delicate timing. Derek needed Crystal and Brett to feel confident, secure in their deception, ready to make the kind of mistake that would justify everything that followed. He found his opportunity in their Christmas plans. Crystal had suggested they host Christmas dinner for her family and close friends, an intimate gathering of 12 people, including Lindsay and, coincidentally, Brett, who would attend as Lindsay's date to maintain appearances. It'll be perfect, Crystal had said, already planning how she and Brett could steal moments together during the celebration. Just our closest friends and family. Derek had agreed enthusiastically, beginning preparations for what he privately called his masterpiece. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. He'd spent 20 years building things that lasted, creating structures that could withstand storms and time. Now he would build something different, a moment of destruction so complete and carefully orchestrated that his targets would never recover from the impact. Christmas was 2 weeks away, and Derek Morrison was finally ready to give his wife and her lover the gift they truly deserved. Chapter 3. The Setup. The snow had been falling for 3 days, blanketing Phoenix in an unusual December storm that transformed the desert city into something almost magical. Derek watched from his office window as workers prepared the Morrison property for Christmas dinner, installing heated walkways and testing outdoor heaters to ensure his guests' comfort. Everything had to be perfect. Crystal was in her element, directing caterers and decorators with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was creating a memorable family gathering. She'd chosen an elegant winter theme, white and gold decorations throughout the house, with crystal centerpieces that caught the light like diamonds. It's going to be beautiful, she'd told Derek that morning, her eyes bright with excitement. Everyone's going to remember this Christmas. Derek had smiled and agreed, though they were remembering it for very different reasons. The guest list had been carefully curated through subtle suggestions and strategic conversations. Crystal's parents, Robert and Helen Sterling, would anchor the family contingent. The Sterlings were old Phoenix money, conservative and traditional, the kind of people who valued reputation above all else. Crystal's younger sister, Brooke, would attend with her husband, a successful plastic surgeon named David Park. Brooke had always lived in Crystal's shadow, quietly resentful of her sister's seemingly perfect marriage and lifestyle. Lindsay Palmer would bring Brett as her date, a fiction that had become increasingly elaborate as the affair continued. To maintain appearances, Lindsay had been telling her other friends that she and Brett were casually dating, though anyone who observed them together could see the lack of genuine chemistry. Miguel Santos and his wife, Elena, rounded out the guest list. Miguel had been growing increasingly suspicious of Crystal's behavior, his military-trained instincts picking up on subtle changes in her demeanor and routine. The final guests were Amanda Cross and her husband, Tom, a financial advisor who Derek had recently hired to manage some of his business investments. Derek had invited them ostensibly to discuss the luxury development project, but their presence served a more important purpose in his plan. As Christmas Eve morning arrived, Derek made his final preparations. In his home office, secured behind a door that only he could access, Derek reviewed the evidence he'd compiled over the past months. Photos, recordings, financial documents, and security footage. Enough material to destroy both Crystal and Brett in multiple ways. But Derek's plan wasn't simply about exposure. Public humiliation was just the beginning. The real gift lay in the wrap box he'd placed under the Christmas tree the night before. An elegant white package with gold ribbon that matched Crystal's decorating theme perfectly. Inside was a carefully prepared dossier that would serve as the foundation for everything that followed. Derek had learned from his years in construction that demolition required precision. You couldn't simply destroy. You had to control the collapse, ensure that the structure fell exactly where you wanted it to fall, that the debris landed on the right targets. The divorce papers that would be served during dinner were just the first explosive charge. The real demolition would begin when Crystal and Brett opened their Christmas present. As afternoon approached, Derek dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that Crystal had bought him the previous year. He wanted to look successful, composed, completely in control when everything began to unravel. The first guests arrived at 5 o'clock. Crystal's parents, dressed in formal attire and carrying expensive wine. Robert Sterling was a retired real estate developer who'd built his fortune in commercial properties during Phoenix's boom years. Helen was old money society, the kind of woman who'd rather die than be associated with scandal. "Derek, my boy," Robert said, shaking hands with the firm grip of a man who'd built an empire through personal relationships. "Crystal says you've been working too hard lately. You need to learn to delegate." "I've been learning that lesson recently," Derek replied, his tone carrying a meaning that Robert wouldn't understand until later. Brooke and David arrived next, followed by Miguel and Elena. Derek watched as his wife transformed into the perfect hostess, greeting everyone with warmth and enthusiasm while subtly checking her phone for messages for Brett. Lindsay and Brett arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that was clearly rehearsed. Brett wore an expensive suit and his most charming smile, playing the role of Lindsay's attentive date, while his eyes immediately sought Crystal. Brett Hoffman, he introduced himself to Robert Sterling, producing a business card with practiced ease. "I've heard wonderful things about your daughter's taste in homes. Derek's quite the architect." "Builder," Derek corrected quietly. "I build things. I tear them down when necessary, too." Amanda and Tom Cross arrived last, completing the dinner party. Derek watched as Brett's confident expression faltered slightly when he saw Amanda, clearly not expecting his business partner at what was supposed to be a social gathering. "Amanda," Brett said, his voice carrying forced enthusiasm. "I didn't know you and Derek were friends." "We've been working together on a new project," Derek replied smoothly. "I wanted to discuss some details with her husband about the financial structuring. Business and pleasure, you know how it is." As cocktails were served in the living room, Derek positioned himself where he could observe everyone's interactions. Crystal and Brett maintained perfect social distance, but Derek caught the subtle glances, the carefully timed movements that kept them in each other's proximity. Lindsay was nervous, her usual confidence replaced by fidgety energy as she overcompensated for the deception she was helping to maintain. She laughed too loudly at Brett's jokes and touched his arm with performances that fooled no one who was really paying attention. Miguel was watching everyone with the careful attention of someone who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. Elena chatted with Crystal about holiday plans, unaware that this would be the last Christmas the Morrison family would spend together. At 7 o'clock, Derek called everyone to dinner. The dining room looked spectacular. Crystal's Winter Wonderland theme had created an atmosphere of elegant celebration. The long table gleamed with crystal and silver, candles casting warm light over the pristine white tablecloth. Derek took his place at the head of the table, Crystal at the opposite end. The seating arrangement had been carefully planned. Brett and Lindsay on one side, close enough to communicate with subtle glances, but not close enough for private conversation. Crystal's parents flanked Derek, their presence adding weight to everything that was about to unfold. As the first course was served, Derek raised his glass for a toast. To family, he said, his gray eyes moving deliberately around the table. To the people we trust with our most precious secrets, our deepest vulnerabilities. To the bonds that define us, and the choices that reveal who we truly are. Everyone raised their glasses, Crystal's hand trembling slightly as she met Derek's gaze. Brett smiled his charming smile, completely unaware that he was toasting his own destruction. Derek's phone buzzed with a text message, the signal he'd been waiting for. The process server was outside, ready to deliver the first of Christmas evening surprises. The demolition was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Serving of Papers. Derek excused himself from the table as the main course was being prepared, ostensibly to check on the caterers, but actually to coordinate the next phase of his plan. Through the kitchen window, he could see the process server waiting in an unmarked car, the divorce papers ready for delivery. The timing had to be perfect. Derek needed Crystal to feel secure, surrounded by family and friends, before the first blow landed. He needed Brett to be comfortable, confident in their deception, when everything began to unravel. Returning to the dining room, Derek found the conversation flowing smoothly. Robert Sterling was telling Brett about Phoenix's commercial real estate market, while Helen discussed charity work with Elena. Crystal was laughing at something David had said, her cheeks flushed with wine and what she believed was successful deception. "Dinner smells wonderful," Derek announced, retaking his seat. "Crystal, you've outdone yourself with the planning." "I wanted tonight to be special," Crystal replied, her eyes meeting his with what she probably thought was affection, but Derek recognized as guilt. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:15, cutting through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk. "I'll get it," Derek said, rising calmly. "Probably just a neighbor dropping off a Christmas card." He returned moments later with an official-looking man in a dark suit, carrying a leather portfolio. "Folks, I apologize for the interruption," Derek announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "This gentleman needs to deliver some documents that apparently couldn't wait until after the holidays." The process server stepped forward with professional efficiency. "Crystal Morrison?" Crystal's face went pale as she nodded, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "You've been served," the man said simply, placing the divorce papers beside her plate before turning and walking back toward the door. The silence that followed was absolute. 12 people sat around an elegant table, the only sound the soft crackling of candles and the distant hum of Christmas music from the living room. Crystal stared at the papers as if they might disappear, her hands shaking as she reached for them. "Derek, what is this?" "Divorce papers," Derek replied calmly, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. "I thought it was time we stopped pretending." "You can't be serious," Crystal stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Christmas. Our families are here. This is insane." Brett had gone rigid in his chair, his charming facade cracking as he realized the implications. Lindsay's face was flushed with embarrassment and fear, while the rest of the table sat in stunned silence. Derek continued eating, his movements unhurried and controlled. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. I believe in honesty. Crystal, I thought it was time our marriage reflected our true feelings." Crystal's mother, Helen, found her voice first. "Derek, surely this is some kind of misunderstanding. You two have seemed so happy." "Have we?" Derek interrupted, looking directly at his wife. "Crystal, would you say we've been happy? Would you say our marriage has been fulfilling for you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Crystal's eyes darted around the table, seeking support, escape, anything but the truth that Derek was demanding. We should discuss this privately," Crystal managed, her social training warring with her panic. "I think our families deserve to understand what's been happening," Derek said, his tone remaining conversational despite the devastating words. "After all, they've invested so much in our marriage. Your parents especially, Crystal. They've been so proud of the life we've built together." Robert Sterling's face was darkening with each word, his businessman's instincts recognizing a calculated attack when he saw one. "Derek, what exactly are you implying?" Derek smiled, the expression as cold as the winter storm outside. I'm not implying anything, Robert. I'm stating facts. Crystal has been having an affair for the past 6 months. She's been lying to all of us, treating our marriage like a joke while pursuing her own interests. The explosion that followed was immediate and chaotic. Helen gasped as if she'd been physically struck. Brooke's eyes widened with shock that quickly transformed into something resembling satisfaction. Miguel leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. But Derek's attention was focused on Brett, watching as the man's face cycled through surprise, fear, and desperate calculation. That's completely ridiculous, Brett said, his voice carrying forced indignation. Derek, I think you've been under too much stress. Maybe you should. Should what? Derek interrupted, turning his full attention to Brett for the first time. Should ignore the evidence? Should pretend I don't know about your afternoon visits to her yoga studio? Should forget about the restaurant receipts and hotel charges? Crystal was crying now, tears streaking her makeup as the carefully constructed facade of her life crumbled in real time. Derek, please. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Won't it be better? Derek asked genuinely. When would be the appropriate time to acknowledge that you've been fucking Brett Hoffman for 6 months while playing the devoted wife at dinner parties? The crude language hit the formal dinner gathering like a physical blow. Helen Sterling actually recoiled, while Robert's face turned red with rage. Crystal, Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Is this true? Crystal looked around the table desperately, seeking someone who might defend her, someone who might help her escape the trap that Derek had so carefully constructed. But there was nowhere to run, no words that could undo what had been said. It's complicated, she whispered. It's really not, Derek replied, signing the divorce papers with smooth strokes of his pen. I've already signed these. The division of assets is quite straightforward. You get nothing. You can't do that, Brett said, finally abandoning his pretense of innocence. Arizona is a community property state. She has rights. Does she? Derek's smile widened. That's interesting that you know so much about divorce law, Brett. Almost like you've done this before. Derek reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it on the table next to the divorce papers. I had some research done on your romantic history, Brett. Fascinating reading. It seems you have a pattern of pursuing married women, particularly wives of successful men. Amanda Cross, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Is that why you've been so distracted lately? Why you've missed 3 major client meetings this month? Brett's face went ashen as he realized the trap was closing from multiple directions. Amanda, this isn't what it looks like. Really? Derek interjected. Because it looks like you've been using your business partnership as cover to seduce my wife while neglecting your professional responsibilities. Amanda, I think you should know that Brett charged several of his dates with Crystal to your company credit card. Restaurant bills, hotel rooms, even jewelry purchases. Amanda's husband, Tom, leaned forward with the expression of someone who just realized he was watching a financial crime unfold. As a financial advisor, he understood immediately the implications of what Derek was suggesting. Brett, Amanda said slowly, please tell me you didn't use company funds for personal expenses. The silence that followed answered her question more effectively than words could have. Derek looked around the table, taking in the faces of everyone present. The shock, the disgust, the dawning realization that they were witnessing the complete destruction of 2 people's lives. Now, Derek said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed. Who wants dessert? Because I have a very special Christmas present to share with everyone. He gestured toward the elegantly wrapped box under the Christmas tree, and Crystal's eyes followed his movement with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that her nightmare was just beginning. My wife's best friend bet her I'd cry when they served me divorce papers at Christmas dinner, Derek continued, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Men are so predictable, she laughed. Well, I signed immediately, then handed them a wrapped present. Derek's eyes moved to Lindsay, who had gone white with terror. Lindsay, would you like to do the honors? After all, you helped make this Christmas so memorable. Chapter 5. The Present. The wrapped box sat under the Christmas tree like a time bomb, its elegant white paper and gold ribbon mocking the devastation that had already consumed the dinner party. Derek's invitation hung in the air as everyone stared at the innocent-looking package. Lindsay Palmer's face had gone from white to green, her attorney's instincts recognizing the careful setup of Derek's words. She'd made that bet with Crystal 3 weeks ago during one of their lunch meetings, laughing about how predictable men were when their pride was wounded. I don't think I should," Lindsay stammered, her hands shaking as she reached for her wine glass. "Nonsense," Derek said, rising from his chair with predatory grace. "You were so confident about men's predictability. Surely you're curious to see if your theory holds true." Crystal was still crying, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she clutched the divorce papers. "Derek, please. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're proving." "I'm not trying to prove anything," Derek interrupted, walking to the tree and retrieving the package. "I'm simply sharing the truth. All of it. With everyone who deserves to know." He placed the box in the center of the dining table, among the crystal glasses and elegant place settings that now seemed obscene in the context of the unfolding destruction. "Brett," Derek said, his tone conversational, "since you seem to enjoy unwrapping things that don't belong to you, why don't you do the honors?" Brett's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for the package. "Derek, whatever game you're playing." "Game?" Derek's laugh was cold and sharp. "This isn't a game, Brett. This is consequence. This is what happens when you mistake a man's kindness for weakness." The silence in the room was oppressive as Brett unwrapped the package with the careful movements of someone defusing a bomb. The white paper fell away to reveal an expensive wooden box, the kind used for important documents or family heirlooms. Inside, nestled in black velvet, were printed photographs, legal documents, and what appeared to be financial records. Brett lifted the first photograph, and his face went completely white. It was a picture of him and Crystal entering his downtown condo, taken through a telephoto lens with professional clarity. The timestamp showed it was from the previous Tuesday afternoon, when Crystal had told Derek she was shopping with her sister. "Keep going," Derek encouraged. "There's so much more." Brett's hand shook as he revealed the next layer. Bank records showing the company credit card charges Amanda had just learned about, restaurant receipts with intimate messages written on them, hotel bills from their afternoon encounters. But the photographs were the most damaging. Derek's private investigator had been thorough, capturing Crystal and Brett in compromising positions, intimate moments that destroyed any possibility of denying the affair's physical nature. "Oh my God," Helen Sterling whispered, covering her mouth as she saw her daughter's face in one of the images. Crystal lunged for the box, trying to grab the evidence, but Derek caught her wrist with gentle firmness. "Everyone needs to see Crystal. They deserve to understand what kind of people they've been defending." Robert Sterling's face was now purple with rage as he examined a photograph of his daughter kissing another man in a restaurant where Derek had taken her for their anniversary the previous year. "Crystal," Robert's voice was barely controlled fury. "How could you do this? How could you embarrass our family like this?" "It wasn't supposed to happen," Crystal sobbed. "I never meant for it to go this far. Derek, you have to understand, I was lonely. You were always working, always focused on business. You needed excitement," Derek finished coldly. "You needed passion. You needed someone who didn't treat marriage like a business contract. Isn't that right?" Those were your words, recorded in Brett's condo 3 weeks ago. He reached into the box and withdrew a small digital recorder, pressing play. Crystal's voice filled the dining room, discussing her marriage with casual cruelty that made everyone at the table wince. "Derek's so boring," her recorded voice said. "He thinks providing for me is the same as loving me. He's like a machine. Wake up, work, come home, repeat. There's no spontaneity, no passion. Sometimes I feel like I married a robot." Brett's voice responded on the recording. "Guys like him, they don't understand women like you. You need someone who appreciates your fire, your spirit. You deserve so much more than a glorified contractor." The words hit Derek's family and friends like physical blows. Miguel's wife, Elena, actually gasped. Brooke looked at her sister with unconcealed disgust. Even Lindsay appeared shocked by the casual cruelty of the recorded conversation. But Derek wasn't finished. The final layer of the box contained documents that transformed the situation from personal betrayal to potential criminal liability. "Amanda," Derek said, addressing Brett's business partner directly, "I think you'll find those financial records particularly interesting. It seems Brett has been creative with your company's expense accounts." Amanda studied the documents with growing horror. Credit card statements showed charges at expensive restaurants during times when Brett claimed to be working. Hotel bills for client meetings that lasted for hours. Jewelry purchases labeled as client appreciation gifts, but actually given to Crystal. "Brett," Amanda's voice was deadly quiet. "You've been embezzling from our partnership." "It's not embezzlement," Brett protested weakly. "Those are legitimate business expenses. Sometimes you have to entertain clients, build relationships, by fucking other men's wives." Miguel Santos spoke for the first time, his military background evident in his direct approach to the situation. Derek reached into his jacket and withdrew another envelope, this one sealed with his attorney's letterhead. "Amanda, I think you'll want to pursue this criminally. My lawyer has prepared all the necessary documentation for the police and the state licensing board." Brett's face went from white to gray as he realized the full scope of Derek's preparation. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. This was about destroying him completely. "The Real Estate Commission will be very interested in these financial irregularities," Derek continued. "Professional licensing boards take ethics violations seriously, especially when they involve theft from business partners." Crystal was crying harder now, her social facade completely shattered. "Derek, please. I'll end it. We can go to counseling. We can work this out. Please don't destroy everything over one mistake." "One mistake?" Derek's voice carried genuine surprise. "Crystal, you've been lying to me for 6 months. You've humiliated me in front of our friends, discussed our private life with your lover, and treated our marriage vows like suggestions. Which part of that was a mistake?" He gestured to the photographs scattered across the table. "These weren't accidents. These are choices. Hundreds of choices to betray your family, your commitments, and your own integrity." Robert Sterling stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Helen, we're leaving. Now." "Dad, please," Crystal begged. "Don't do this. I'm still your daughter." Robert looked at her with the expression of someone seeing a stranger. "My daughter wouldn't have done this. My daughter wouldn't have brought this shame on our family." As Crystal's parents gathered their coats, the rest of the dinner party began to dissolve. Brooke and David made their excuses, Brooke unable to hide her satisfaction at her sister's downfall. Miguel and Elena left quietly, Miguel squeezing Derek's shoulder in silent support. Amanda and Tom Cross remained, Amanda studying the financial documents with the focus of someone preparing for legal battle. "Derek, I need copies of everything related to the company finances. I'm going to destroy him." "Of course," Derek replied. "My attorney has prepared complete packets for everyone who needs them. Brett's pattern of behavior extends beyond just my wife." Lindsay Palmer sat frozen in her chair, realizing that her role in facilitating the affair had been fully documented. As a divorce attorney, she understood that her professional reputation was about to be destroyed along with everything else. "Derek," Lindsay said quietly, "what do you want from me?" Derek's smile was cold and final. "Nothing, Lindsay. You've already given me everything I needed. Every lie you told, every alibi you provided, every time you helped them meet, it's all been documented. Your law firm will receive copies of everything tomorrow morning." As the last guest departed, Derek stood alone in his dining room, surrounded by the debris of his carefully orchestrated demolition. The elegant table setting looked like a crime scene, scattered with photographs and documents that had destroyed multiple lives in the span of an hour. Crystal remained in her chair, sobbing quietly, the divorce papers clutched in her hands. Brett had fled without saying goodbye, leaving his business partner and his lover to face the consequences alone. Derek poured himself a glass of wine and surveyed his work. The foundation of his old life had been completely demolished, but that had always been part of the plan. You couldn't build something new without first clearing the ground. And Derek Morrison was far from finished building. Chapter 6. The aftermath. The weeks following Christmas dinner unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, each movement building on the last until the crescendo of Derek's revenge reached every corner of Crystal and Brett's lives. Brett Hoffman's world collapsed first with the mechanical precision Derek had engineered. Amanda Cross filed both civil and criminal charges within 48 hours of Christmas, armed with the comprehensive financial documentation Derek had provided. The Real Estate Licensing Board launched an immediate investigation, freezing Brett's assets pending resolution of the embezzlement charges. Local media picked up the story. Successful real estate agent accused of stealing from business partner to fund affair with married client. The scandal rippled through Phoenix's tight-knit real estate community like wildfire, destroying professional relationships Brett had spent years building. Derek watched from his office as Brett's downtown condo went into foreclosure, his luxury car was repossessed, and his country club membership was revoked. The man who had called Derek a glorified contractor was now facing felony charges and professional ruin. But Derek's true masterpiece was the systematic destruction of Crystal's social standing. The photographs from the Christmas present had begun circulating through Phoenix's social media networks within hours of the dinner party. Someone, Derek suspected Brooke, had shared them strategically, ensuring that Crystal's adultery became the subject of gossip at every charity luncheon, book club, and yoga class in their social circle. Crystal's attempt to maintain her lifestyle became increasingly desperate and pathetic. She tried attending her usual charity events, only to find herself frozen out by women who had once competed for her attention. Her gym membership was quietly terminated after other members complained about her presence. Even her favorite restaurants began finding reasons to cancel her reservations. The divorce proceedings moved forward with brutal efficiency. Derek's prenuptial agreement, which Crystal had signed without reading 12 years earlier, ensured that she received only what Arizona law required. Essentially nothing from Derek's business or real estate holdings. Her parents cut off all financial support, horrified by the public humiliation she had brought on the Sterling family name. Robert Sterling issued a formal statement distancing the family from Crystal's actions, effectively disowning her in all but legal terms. Lindsay Palmer's legal career imploded with similar thoroughness. Derek's documentation of her role in facilitating the affair reached her law firm's ethics committee, resulting in a formal investigation that would likely end with her disbarment. Her divorce attorney practice evaporated as clients fled, unwilling to be associated with someone who had helped destroy a marriage. By February, Crystal was living in a studio apartment in Tempe, working as a receptionist at a dental office, the only job she could find with her limited skills and damaged reputation. Her social media accounts, once filled with pictures of luxury vacations and designer purchases, now sat largely empty. Derek observed her downfall with the satisfaction of an architect watching a successful demolition. Every aspect of Crystal's destruction had been precisely calculated, each consequence flowing naturally from the choices she and Brett had made. But Derek's revenge extended beyond mere financial and social ruin. The real genius of his plan lay in how he had turned Crystal and Brett's own actions against them, using their betrayal to expose deeper character flaws that made redemption impossible. Crystal's attempts to win back Derek's forgiveness became increasingly desperate and pathetic. She appeared at his office at construction sites, even at his home, begging for another chance while displaying the exact selfishness that had driven her to adultery in the first place. "I made a mistake," she had sobbed during one particularly humiliating encounter outside Derek's office. "One mistake, Derek. Doesn't 12 years of marriage mean anything?" Derek had looked at her with a dispassionate assessment he might give a structural defect in a building. "Crystal, you made hundreds of choices to betray our marriage. The only mistake was thinking you were clever enough to get away with it." Her desperation revealed the shallow, entitled woman Derek had gradually realized he'd married. Crystal had never truly loved him. She had loved what he provided, the lifestyle he enabled, the social status his success had given her. Brett's destruction followed a different trajectory, but reached the same destination. Facing criminal charges and professional ruin, he attempted to salvage a situation by testifying against Crystal in the civil proceedings, claiming she had seduced him and manipulated him into the affair. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Derek's recordings revealed Brett's role as the pursuer, his calculated seduction of a married woman, his casual contempt for Derek and their marriage. The testimony only reinforced his image as a predator who targeted vulnerable women. Derek had manipulated the situation perfectly, ensuring that Brett and Crystal's attempts to save themselves only accelerated their mutual destruction. By spring, Derek began the next phase of his plan, rebuilding. The luxury housing development he had discussed with Amanda Cross moved forward rapidly. With Brett out of the picture, Amanda proved to be an exceptional business partner, bringing the kind of professional dedication that Derek valued above all else. Derek's construction company experienced unprecedented growth, partly due to his increased focus on work, but mostly because his reputation for ruthless efficiency had spread throughout Phoenix's business community. Other successful men, witnessing how Derek had handled his wife's betrayal, sought him out as a contractor they could trust. "You didn't just destroy them," Miguel observed during one of their weekly dinners. "You built something better from the wreckage." Derek smiled, raising his glass of wine. "That's what builders do, Miguel. We clear the ground of everything that's rotted and weak, then we construct something that will last." The Morrison house itself had been transformed. Derek removed every trace of Crystal's presence, redecorating with clean lines and masculine efficiency. The home that had once showcased Crystal's expensive taste now reflected Derek's practical nature and uncompromising standards. But Derek's revenge wasn't complete. The foundation had been laid, the structure demolished, but the final phase required patience and perfect timing. Crystal and Brett's destruction had been thorough but relatively quick. Derek's real masterpiece would unfold over years, ensuring that the consequences of their betrayal would follow them for the rest of their lives. He had planted seeds that would grow into permanent exile from the life they had once known, ensuring that neither of them would ever again find the security, respect, or love they had so carelessly thrown away. Derek Morrison was a patient man, and his revenge was just beginning to reach its full potential. Chapter 7. The Long Game. 2 years after the Christmas dinner that destroyed his marriage, Derek Morrison stood in the penthouse office of his expanded construction empire, looking out over the Phoenix skyline that increasingly bore his architectural signature. The city had become his canvas, and every luxury development, every commercial project, every prestigious contract served as both a symbol of his success and a tool of his continuing revenge. Derek's transformation from successful contractor to construction mogul hadn't been accidental. Every business decision, every partnership, every strategic alliance had been calculated to ensure that Crystal and Brett would remain permanently exiled from the life they had once known. The luxury housing development with Amanda Cross had become Derek's launching pad into Phoenix's elite development circles. Amanda, driven by her own desire for revenge against Brett's betrayal, had proven to be a ruthless and effective partner. Together, they had cornered significant portions of the high-end real estate market, establishing a network of influence that extended throughout the city's social and business communities. Crystal's attempts to rebuild her life had been systematically thwarted by Derek's expanding influence. Every time she found a better job, Derek's connections ensured that her employer learned about her history. When she tried to move to better neighborhoods, property managers discovered reasons to reject her applications. Her attempts to return to her social circle were blocked by the wives of Derek's business partners, who viewed association with Crystal as professional and social suicide. But Derek's most elegant manipulation involved Brett's continuing destruction. The criminal charges for embezzlement had resulted in a plea bargain, 18 months in minimum security prison and 5 years probation. Brett's real estate license was permanently revoked, his professional reputation destroyed beyond repair. But Derek had ensured that Brett's punishment extended far beyond legal consequences. Through carefully managed business relationships, Derek had blacklisted Brett from virtually every legitimate employment opportunity in Arizona. Companies that considered hiring him received anonymous tips about his criminal history and tendency toward professional misconduct. Service businesses he might have started found their permits delayed, their insurance claims denied, their business licenses challenged. Brett had been forced to leave Phoenix entirely, relocating to Portland where he worked construction jobs under assumed names, always looking over his shoulder for the reach of Derek's influence. But Derek's patience had revealed an opportunity for a more sophisticated revenge. Brett's sister, Michelle, lived in Portland and had been helping him rebuild his life. She was a successful marketing executive, married to a software engineer, with 2 children and a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Michelle had always disapproved of Brett's womanizing, but had stood by him during his legal troubles, believing that everyone deserved a second chance. Derek had spent 6 months researching Michelle's life, her husband's business, their social circle, their children's schools. He had discovered that Michelle's husband, Gary, was developing a mobile app that could revolutionize small business inventory management. The couple had invested their savings into the project and were seeking venture capital funding to launch the company. Derek's approach was masterful in its subtlety. Through a series of shell companies and business intermediaries, Derek arranged for Gary's app to receive preliminary funding from what appeared to be a Portland-based investment group. The terms were generous, enough money to quit his day job and focus full-time on development, with promises of larger funding rounds as the product reached market milestones. Gary and Michelle were ecstatic. After years of struggling to balance his software development with full-time employment, Gary could finally pursue his entrepreneurial dreams. They celebrated by upgrading their house, enrolling their children in private schools, and planning the family vacation they had postponed for years. The funding was real, but Derek controlled it through untraceable corporate structures. For 18 months, he allowed Gary's company to develop and launch the app, building hope and momentum while creating dependencies that would make the eventual collapse more devastating. During this time, Derek also orchestrated Brett's apparent recovery. Anonymous job opportunities appeared that allowed Brett to work in his preferred field again. His Portland apartment was upgraded through housing assistance programs that Derek secretly funded. Brett began to believe that his life was improving, that his sister's support and his own efforts were finally paying off. The trap was set with meticulous precision. In the 3rd quarter of Gary's 2nd year of development, Derek activated the final phase of his plan. The funding was suddenly withdrawn due to market conditions and strategic shifts in the investment group's priorities. Gary's company collapsed overnight, leaving him with enormous debts, failed obligations to employees, and professional reputation destroyed by his inability to deliver on promised contracts. Michelle and Gary lost their house, their children's private school tuition, and their life savings. Gary's mental health deteriorated under the pressure, leading to depression and alcohol abuse that further complicated their situation. But Derek's cruelest stroke was ensuring that Brett discovered the truth about who had orchestrated their destruction. An anonymous package arrived at Brett's apartment containing financial documents that traced the investment funding back to Derek's shell companies. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Derek Morrison had deliberately built up Brett's sister's family just to destroy them more completely. Brett's call to Derek came at exactly the time Derek had predicted. "You destroyed my sister's life." Brett's voice was ragged with grief and rage. "Michelle and Gary never did anything to you. Their kids didn't deserve this." Derek's response was calm and measured. "Your sister chose to help you rebuild your life after you betrayed mine. Actions have consequences, Brett. Sometimes those consequences extend to the people who enable them." "They're innocent," Brett protested. "Whatever you think I deserve, they don't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. Weren't Crystal and I innocent when you decided to pursue your affair?" Derek replied, "Didn't we deserve better than being betrayed by people we trusted? You made choices, Brett. Your sister made choices. Now you both live with the consequences." The conversation ended with Brett's sobbing plea for mercy that Derek ignored with the same cold efficiency he'd brought to every aspect of his revenge. But Derek's plan had one final, devastating component. Michelle's investigation into her family's financial collapse had led her to discover Brett's affair with Crystal, the criminal charges, and the complete truth about her brother's character. The stress of losing everything while learning that Brett had caused their destruction through his own moral failures created a rift in their relationship that could never be repaired. Michelle cut all contact with Brett, leaving him alone in Portland with nothing but the knowledge that his actions had destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of everyone who had tried to help him. Derek received confirmation of Brett's complete isolation through private investigator reports that arrived monthly like clockwork. Brett Hoffman, who had once charmed his way through Phoenix's social circles, now lived alone in a studio apartment, working day labor jobs and drinking himself toward an early grave. The symmetry was perfect. Brett had destroyed Derek's family, so Derek had ensured that Brett lost his family in return. The man who had taken everything Derek valued was now experiencing the same isolation and despair. Crystal's punishment followed a similar trajectory of escalating consequences that extended beyond her immediate circumstances to touch every aspect of her future. Derek had established a network of surveillance and sabotage that ensured Crystal could never rebuild the life she had thrown away. But his most devastating move involved her parents and sister, the family relationships that might have provided foundation for recovery. Chapter 8: Blood and Betrayal. Derek's manipulation of Crystal's family relationships required the delicate touch of a master strategist, but the foundations for their destruction had been laid years before the affair was discovered. Crystal's sister Brooke had always lived in her shadow, the less attractive, less successful, less charming sister who watched Crystal receive everything while working twice as hard for half the recognition. The affair and its explosive revelation had given Brooke an opportunity she had unconsciously been waiting for her entire life, the chance to finally be the good daughter. Derek had nurtured this dynamic with careful precision over the past 2 years. His construction company had been hired to renovate Brooke and David's medical practice, a project that brought Derek into regular contact with the couple. During these interactions, Derek had gradually revealed additional details about Crystal's betrayal, the depth of her lies, the casual cruelty of her recorded statements, the complete disregard she had shown for family loyalty. She called your mother uptight and judgmental, Derek had mentioned during one construction meeting, showing Brooke transcripts of Crystal's conversations with Brett. She said your father cared more about reputation than family, that she was tired of living up to sterling family expectations. Each revelation had driven the wedge deeper between Crystal and her sister, until Brooke's sympathy had transformed into active hostility. But Derek's masterstroke involved Robert Sterling's business legacy. Robert Sterling had built his real estate empire through traditional values: honesty, reliability, family reputation. The scandal of Crystal's affair had genuinely devastated him, not just personally, but professionally. In Phoenix's conservative business community, family scandals reflected on business integrity. Derek had positioned himself perfectly to exploit this vulnerability. His construction company's success had made him an attractive partner for Sterling's commercial development projects. What began as a professional relationship gradually became something approaching father-son mentorship, with Robert finding in Derek the principled, hard-working son-in-law he had thought he had but lost. You remind me of myself at your age, Robert had told Derek during a business dinner 6 months earlier. Focused, determined, unwilling to compromise your values for easy success. Derek had encouraged this relationship, while simultaneously ensuring that every interaction reminded Robert of Crystal's failures. Business meetings became opportunities to contrast Derek's integrity with Crystal's betrayal, his work ethic with her selfishness, his loyalty with her adultery. The psychological manipulation was devastating in its subtlety. Robert began to view Derek not just as a business partner, but as the son he wished he'd had, while Crystal became a source of shame and disappointment that he couldn't bear to acknowledge. When Crystal attempted to reconcile with her parents 18 months after the divorce, she found a wall of rejection that Derek had carefully constructed. Her father's business associates now included Derek as a key partner in multiple ventures. Accepting Crystal back into the family would mean acknowledging her presence at business functions, charity events, and social gatherings where Derek was increasingly prominent. Robert couldn't maintain both relationships without constant awkwardness and professional complications. Helen Sterling, always concerned with social appearances, found that her daughter's presence reminded everyone of the family's greatest scandal. Crystal's attempts to attend family gatherings created tension and embarrassment that eventually led to her being excluded entirely. Brooke's role in this exclusion was particularly cruel. As the remaining good daughter, she had gradually assumed Crystal's former position in family dynamics, becoming the child who received parental approval and support. Brooke's own children, Crystal's niece and nephew, were taught to view their aunt as a cautionary tale about moral failure. Crystal made choices that hurt our family. Brooke explained to her children when they asked why Aunt Crystal never visited anymore. Sometimes when people make bad choices, they have to live with the consequences. Derek observed this family destruction with the satisfaction of an architect whose building had performed exactly as designed under stress testing. But the psychological component of his revenge required deeper understanding of Crystal's character flaws, the weaknesses that had made her affair possible in the first place. Crystal had always defined herself through external validation: her appearance, her social status, her husband's success, her family's approval. Without these foundations, she had begun a spiral of self-destruction that Derek nurtured with surgical precision. Every time Crystal showed signs of genuine recovery, new job, new relationship, new attempt at self-improvement, Derek's network ensured that her progress was undermined. Not obviously, never in ways that could be traced back to him, but consistently enough to prevent any real stability from developing. The pattern created a cycle of hope and despair that gradually broke down Crystal's psychological resilience. She began to believe that she was fundamentally flawed, unworthy of happiness or success, destined to face consequences for the rest of her life. Derek's most psychologically devastating move involved the children Crystal had always planned to have. During their marriage, Crystal had postponed pregnancy multiple times, claiming she wasn't ready for the responsibility. Derek had agreed, respecting her desire to enjoy their early married years before starting a family. Now, at 37 and divorced, Crystal faced the reality that her fertile years were ending without the children she had assumed would always be available when she was ready. Her attempts to find a serious relationship had been consistently sabotaged by Derek's influence network, but more importantly by her own damaged reputation and psychological state. Men who might have considered her despite her history were deterred by her obvious instability and the social complications that came with dating Derek Morrison's notorious ex-wife. Crystal's growing desperation led to increasingly poor choices in relationships. Men who used her, men who had no interest in commitment, men who reminded her constantly of her diminished status and limited options. Derek received monthly reports on Crystal's deteriorating situation through the private investigators he maintained. The woman who had once commanded attention at charity galas now worked multiple part-time jobs to afford her studio apartment. The woman who had called Derek predictable now lived in chaos, her life a series of crises and failed attempts at stability. But Derek's revenge had one final component that would ensure its permanence. Crystal's complete social exile had been engineered to serve a larger purpose. Derek wanted her isolation to be so complete, her circumstances so desperate, that any future attempt at happiness would seem impossible not just to others, but to Crystal herself. The psychological pressure was designed to break her will, to continue trying, to make her accept that her life would never recover from the choices she had made during those 6 months of adultery. Derek's plan was working perfectly. Crystal had begun showing signs of clinical depression, her already limited social skills deteriorating under the constant stress of financial insecurity and social rejection. Her attempts to contact Derek had become increasingly pathetic. Letters begging for forgiveness, phone calls pleading for a chance to explain, even showing up at his office with proposals for reconciliation that demonstrated how completely she had lost touch with reality. Derek saved every letter, recorded every phone call, documented every desperate attempt at contact, not as evidence for legal purposes, but as trophies of his successful campaign to reduce the woman who had betrayed him to complete psychological submission. The final phase of Derek's revenge was approaching, the moment when Crystal would face the ultimate consequence of her choices, the realization that her suffering would never end, that no redemption was possible, that Derek Morrison's revenge was as permanent and unforgiving as the buildings he constructed. Chapter 9. The Final Foundation. 5 years after the Christmas dinner that destroyed his marriage, Derek Morrison stood in the penthouse of his newly completed headquarters building, the tallest structure in downtown Phoenix, bearing his name in steel letters that caught the desert sunlight like a monument to his success. The Morrison Tower wasn't just a symbol of his business empire. It was the final piece of his revenge, a permanent reminder to everyone who had betrayed him that Derek Morrison's memory was as enduring as the concrete and steel he used to build his legacy. From his corner office on the 40th floor, Derek could see the entire city he had conquered through strategic brilliance and ruthless determination. His construction company now employed over 300 people. His real estate partnerships controlled significant portions of Phoenix's luxury development market, and his political connections ensured that his influence extended into every corner of the city's power structure. But Derek's true masterpiece wasn't visible from his office window. It was the complete and systematic destruction of everyone who had betrayed him, a process that had reached its perfect conclusion with devastating finality. Crystal Morrison, she had never legally changed her name back to Sterling, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The woman who had once graced charity galas and commanded social attention had been reduced to a ghost haunting the margins of Phoenix society. Her final attempt at rebuilding had come 18 months earlier, when she'd found work as a receptionist at a small law firm that specialized in immigration cases. For 6 months, Crystal had maintained stable employment, begun therapy, and even started dating a paralegal named Marcus who seemed genuinely interested in her despite her history. Derek had allowed this recovery to develop, watching through his network of informants as Crystal began to hope that she might finally escape the consequences of her affair. She'd moved to a better apartment, bought new clothes, started talking about the possibility of a future with Marcus. The destruction Derek engineered was surgical in its precision. Marcus discovered Crystal's history not through Derek's direct intervention, but through a carefully orchestrated series of coincidences that led him to research the woman he was considering marrying. Social media posts that had been strategically preserved, legal documents that were mysteriously accessible, testimony from the criminal case that painted Crystal as a manipulative adulteress who had seduced Brett Hoffman into embezzling funds to support their affair. But Derek's cruelest stroke was the revelation that Crystal had lied to Marcus about her ability to have children. Medical records, legally obtained through Derek's connections in the healthcare community, showed that Crystal had undergone a tubal ligation procedure during her marriage to Derek, a fact she had concealed while allowing Marcus to plan a future that included the family he desperately wanted. Marcus's rejection wasn't just romantic, it was moral. He left Crystal with a kind of disgust and betrayal that echoed Derek's own experience, complete with recorded conversations that demonstrated Crystal's ongoing capacity for deception and manipulation. The parallel was intentional. Derek wanted Crystal to experience the same shock of discovery, the same sense of intimate betrayal, the same realization that someone she trusted had been systematically lying to her. Crystal's response to this final rejection had been complete psychological collapse. She'd lost the law firm job when her emotional instability made her unable to function professionally. The therapy sessions had ended when she could no longer afford them. The better apartment had been abandoned when she could no longer pay rent. Derek's investigators reported that Crystal now lived in a halfway house for women in crisis, working part-time at a grocery store and showing signs of severe depression that bordered on catatonia. She had gained 60 pounds, stopped caring for her appearance, and ceased all attempts at social interaction. The woman who had once mocked Derek's predictability now existed in a state of complete surrender to circumstances she could neither understand nor control. But Derek's revenge had extended beyond Crystal's personal destruction to ensure that her suffering served as a permanent warning to others who might consider betraying him. The story of Crystal Morrison's downfall had become legend in Phoenix's social circles, a cautionary tale that wives whispered to each other about the consequences of adultery. Derek had become a figure of both respect and fear, a man whose loyalty was absolute, but whose revenge was comprehensive and unforgiving. Brett Hoffman's destruction had reached an even more complete conclusion. The systematic sabotage of his sister's family had created a cascade of consequences that destroyed every relationship Brett had ever valued. Michelle's marriage to Gary had ended in divorce after Gary's alcoholism and depression made him unable to function as a husband or father. Their children had been placed in Michelle's custody, but the financial devastation had forced her to move in with her elderly parents while working 2 jobs to support her family. Michelle's research into the source of their destruction had led her to uncover not just Derek's involvement, but the complete truth about Brett's character and the pattern of selfish choices that had created their situation. Her final conversation with her brother had been recorded by Derek's surveillance team and provided regular entertainment during Derek's evening reviews of his revenge's ongoing success. "You destroyed my children's lives," Michelle had screamed at Brett through tears of rage and grief. "My daughter asked me why we lost our house, why Daddy drinks all the time, why we can't afford the things we used to have. What am I supposed to tell her? That her uncle is a lying, cheating, stealing piece of shit who ruins everything he touches." Brett's response had been equally devastating. The weak protestations of a man who finally understood that his actions had consequences extending far beyond his own life, but who remained fundamentally unable to accept responsibility for the choice he had made. Derek had ensured that Brett's isolation was complete. The man who had once charmed his way through Phoenix's social scene now lived alone in a studio apartment in Portland's worst neighborhood, working day labor jobs and drinking away his wages while slowly dying from liver disease that he couldn't afford to treat. The private investigator reports showed that Brett had made several suicide attempts, each time pulling back at the last moment, not from hope but from cowardice. He lacked even the courage to end his own suffering, trapped in a life that held no possibility of improvement or redemption. Derek reviewed these reports with the satisfaction of an architect conducting final inspections on a perfectly executed project. But the crowning achievement of Derek's revenge was the complete reconstruction of his own life into something that stood as a permanent monument to the principles Brett and Crystal had violated. The Morrison Tower wasn't just Derek's headquarters. It was a symbol of what could be built through loyalty, integrity, and uncompromising standards. Every floor housed businesses owned by Derek's allies, men and women who had proven their trustworthiness through years of professional partnership. Derek's penthouse apartment occupied the top floor, a space designed with clean lines and masculine efficiency that reflected his character with perfect honesty. No compromises, no accommodations for anyone else's preferences, no reminders of the failed attempt at partnership that had once defined his life. His social circle consisted entirely of people who shared his values, successful individuals who understood that loyalty was the foundation of all meaningful relationships, that betrayal was unforgivable, and that consequences were permanent. Derek had married again, though the ceremony was a private affair that reflected his new understanding of commitment. Sarah Chun was a successful architect who brought her own resources and reputation to their partnership. More importantly, she understood and respected the principles that governed Derek's life. "I know what happened to your first wife," Sarah had told him during their courtship. "I know what you're capable of when someone betrays you. That's not a weakness, it's integrity. I want to build something with a man who understands that promises matter." Their marriage was everything Derek's first marriage had pretended to be, a genuine partnership between equals who respected each other's strength and independence while building something together that neither could achieve alone. As Derek stood in his office, reviewing the monthly reports on Crystal and Brett's continuing decline, He reflected on the perfect symmetry of his revenge. 5 years earlier, Crystal had bet her best friend that Derek would cry when served divorce papers, laughing about how predictable men were when their pride was wounded. She had been wrong about Derek's predictability, but absolutely correct about one thing. The consequences of her betrayal had been exactly as devastating as any reasonable person might have predicted. Derek Morrison had never cried over his divorce. Instead, he had built an empire from the ashes of his marriage and used it to ensure that the people who had betrayed him would never escape the consequences of their choices. The Christmas present he had given Crystal and Brett had been the gift of truth. The revelation that actions have consequences, that loyalty matters, and that some men's memories are as permanent as the buildings they construct. Derek's revenge was complete, but its effects would continue for the rest of Crystal and Brett's lives. Every day they would wake up to the reality that their suffering was the direct result of their own choices, that their isolation was the price of their betrayal, and that Derek Morrison's forgiveness was as impossible to obtain as a second chance to undo the past. The man who had been called predictable had proven that his enemies had underestimated only one thing: the depth of his commitment to ensuring that betrayal always, inevitably, and permanently carried its own punishment. Derek Morrison had built his revenge like he built everything else, to last forever. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.